Hello, my name is Jennifer Wren Cotton, she, her pronouns. Now, to get the elephant out of the room, my voice might sound a little bit different to be associated with my name. That's because I am a transgender woman. I was raised in a fundamentalist religious cult that outlawed transition and made it impossible for me to begin medical transition at the appropriate age, which would have saved my voice. So, pending the extensive additional therapy and training for vocal feminization down the line, this is the voice that we've got to work with for now. But I'm going to use my voice because for most of my life, my voice was not my own. I was under the control of an authoritarian religious cult, and I want to speak out and help others escape similar situations and ideally help others avoid that sort of abuse in the first place. I am a cult literacy activist and science communicator, and this experiment, this YouTube channel and eventually associated website is called FLYT, and I'm going to explain a little bit of what it's about in this rough and dirty intro episode. We'll see if this stays up on YouTube or just ends up being sort of a test. I had wanted to wait to publish until I'd had everything figured out, all the assets and all the visuals put together, everything really clear and ready for the public to see. And, I've been working on some of that, but I've just really been itching to get something out because, these are issues, these issues of cult control that affect every one of our lives. And, cults most of the time, we think of them as being this crazy thing that only happens with a fringe section of the population, or maybe even only as something fictional. We don't take it too terribly seriously or think that we're ever going to encounter it, but cult psychology is one of the major sociological influences on the planet right now. It's driving increasingly more and more of our politics, and it's doing a lot of damage to individual families and to the planet at large. And I just felt it was extremely important to get something out, even if it's not particularly polished in the beginning. So what are my qualifications? As I mentioned before, I am a cult survivor. I was born into and raised in an authoritarian religious cult, one of the largest in the United States and in the world, and I was in deep. I took it incredibly seriously for many years and was able to observe the inner workings. I was a recruiter myself. I was able to observe how much of the leadership operated. And then after I escaped, made a deep and intensive study for a couple of years now about the science of cult psychology, trying to understand what had happened to me, as many of us do after we escape, because it's so difficult to comprehend. Wait, I believed what? And so, both as a survivor and someone who's been processing their own experience, that's kind of the first qualification. And then the second qualification, I've got kind of an interesting day job. I am a museum exhibit designer. So my job is I take scientific literature and scientific research, which oftentimes is full of jargon and confusing concepts, and I distill it down into a form that the public can understand, ideally at a glance. I simplify complicated concepts and present them in museum exhibits. And I'm wanting to use that skill set around the field of cult psychology. I feel like, unlike the other areas that I've worked in for exhibit design, I do dinosaur exhibits or archaeology exhibits or anthropology exhibits, those sorts of things. There are lots of visuals associated with those sorts of things, and the public has some sort of idea of what the research is like. but the field of psychology, and particularly cult psychology, are very opaque. There's very little in the way of popular media or museum exhibits that express what's going on with cult psychology, which is really a tragedy because, it's a field that affects the way that we make decisions every day. And, most of us, someone else is making most of our decisions, and we don't even understand how that works. We're extra vulnerable. Everyone is vulnerable to cult influence, but extra vulnerable when we don't know how those influences work. So I'm wanting to bring that science communication, exhibit design skill set, entertainment design. That was my degree. Bachelor of Fine Arts in animation, in illustration with an emphasis in animation, aka entertainment design, concept design. All that is to say, I want to make the field of cult psychology easy to grasp through entertaining presentations and exhibits, those sorts of things. That's what FLYT is about. Because here's the thing, we live in an incredibly divided time, and the world is influenced increasingly by extremist groups. This is a resource to hopefully help the world de-radicalize, chill out, and also help people escape abusive situations. So cult literacy, what do I mean by that? So cults, a lot of people have a certain image in mind when they think of a cult. They think of people in hooded robes meeting in a deep underground candlelit lair, chanting things at night. And some cults have that sort of extreme vibe. The cult that I grew up in and escaped had robed ceremonies and chanting and that sort of thing, but not every cult does. What is a cult? Cults are tribes on trauma. They are groups of people that are glued together by abusive control mechanisms. Now, this group can be as small as a family in an abusive partner relationship. Oftentimes, the type of control exercised in those sorts of relationship is described as cult-like and can be very difficult to escape. And the same tactics can be exercised in a group as big as a therapy group or a religion or a company, even a state. We see state cults, situations like North Korea. If you've seen the footage of the North Korean people worshiping the dear leader Kim Jong-un. I grew up in a religious cult, and I'm still dealing with the damage from that, but I happened to escape at a particular time in American history when extremism became more and more rife in our country, when facts became entirely irrelevant to the political discourse, and people couldn't understand why facts about things like elections and the climate and all those sorts of things are just bouncing off people's heads when you can see the data clearly in front of you. And the reason is, the human tribal cohesion instinct, our instinct to stick together to our group, is much more powerful than any instinct that we have to seek out truth. And in order to understand the truth and to not be radicalized, not be controlled, it takes regular mental hygiene. You need to be aware of the principles of coercion and manipulation and recognize when those sorts of things are happening, and then avoid those situations. They're incredibly powerful instincts. They've served us well throughout evolutionary history. Obviously, one of the most important human strengths is in our social group. I think it was Rudyard Kipling who had the line about the strength of the wolf is the pack. Well, the strength of the human is the tribe. And there are very few instincts that scream louder than stay with your tribe. And it can, that instinct can warp reality to the point that facts just bounce off your skull. I know they did for me when I was in my cult. At this point, I'm not going to name a lot of names as far as particular cults and groups. I'm just going to be describing the principles of how they operate. Also, cults can be pretty litigious. Want to avoid legal issues until I've kind of built myself up a little bit and a little bit more prepared to receive that sort of issue. But I think it's so incredibly important for people to become cult literate. So the title of this channel and of the website that I'm currently developing, not yet published, is called FLYT. FLYT Cult Literacy. FLYT stands for Freedom to Liberate Your Thoughts. Now, freedom to liberate, that sounds a little bit redundant, doesn't it? It's like you said, be free twice. But the thing is, everybody wants to be free. Not everyone has the freedom to be free. What does that mean? The human mind is very manipulable. It's very plastic. Our perception of reality can change. And even though everyone wants to be free, not everyone has the tools to be free. This isn't a site about telling you what to think. It's not a site that's a particular movement of recruiting people into a particular doctrine, but just giving people the tools to be able to recognize when someone's messing with your mind. And, some of those things are obvious that you might make sense initially hearing them, and some of the things are a little bit less obvious. And you hear the term mind control, and it evokes images of science fiction and B-movies and, crazy black and white horror movie hypnotist with a pendulum watch or spiral graphics spinning and glowing eyes. Mind control has kind of this very exotic science fiction connotation to it in our society, but it's really much more concrete and observable than that. Let me put it this way. There's a principle that I like to describe as the Stumpy story. What is a Stumpy story? When I was a kid going to elementary school in Northeast Wyoming, we had this thing called Mallow Camp. It was a nature camp, science camp that I think all like the fifth graders, if I remember correctly, we would all go out, and part of your fifth grade experience was to go out and sleep in these cabins and then explore nature with your teachers. And they did that during the fifth grade year at this place called Mallow Camp. Now, as you can imagine, at night, the fifth graders would get pretty riled up and excited. It was, a sleepover of every fifth grader in the school district. If you thought that a sleepover with just a couple of kids gets rowdy, imagine trying to ride herd over that. And so there were rules that, once it was bedtime, you're supposed to stay in your cabin with the lights out, but kids wouldn't listen. And at some point down the line, some camp counselor got really frustrated and decided to tell a scary story to try to keep the kids in their cabins. And it was the story of Stumpy, who was a one-armed axe murderer who would get you if you were outside of your cabin at night, or if you were even too loud at night. Now, there are variations on the story that were told, but basically the principle was You better stay in your cabin, or this axe murderer is gonna catch you and turn you into fifth grader coleslaw, which was pretty terrifying at that age. And that Stumpy story did a great job of controlling our behavior by modifying our reality. This is one of the main ways that mind control works. Now, you could argue about the ethics of that particular situation. It's in a limited context. It's just this 1 week in Malacamp, and it keeps kids from getting out and getting in trouble and maybe getting hurt. Similar stories have been used throughout time to protect kids from, for instance, the water. Kids who don't know how to swim, from protecting them from going down to the river and getting into water that was deeper or faster than they knew how to deal with and getting hurt. In the local area where I live right now, Utah, the Native American tribe of the Ute tribe, they had a story called the Water Babies, of these scary creatures that would get you if you got too close to the water when you were alone. And they would tell this story to their kids, and it would keep them from drowning. Same thing in, I believe, Ireland. They tell the story of Selkies, I think it was called. There are a whole bunch of different stories across cultures that anthropologists have documented of scary creatures that are close to scary things and will keep the kid from drowning. Now, a kid might not be able to comprehend drowning. They might have a higher estimation of their swimming prowess than is merited, which, having a 6-year-old right now, I can understand that. I gotta love him. He oftentimes estimates his abilities as the same as the cartoon characters you might see on TV. So you gotta watch him really closely. And these scary stories, I don't use those for him in the same way. I try to be more honest with him, but I can understand how that sort of scary story would have been beneficial and protective to children in the past. Now, these Stumpy stories can be abused, and they can be expanded into entire religions. You can, depending on your position as it relates to religion, you could describe hell as a Stumpy story of, you better not be bad, or you're gonna get fried, or you're gonna have to live with this guy with horns on his head deep underground in a smelly place for the rest of eternity. That's a pretty scary Stumpy story. Part of my trauma growing up is a Stumpy story about heaven and about being together with your family forever, and it sounded great. It starts out as a nice story, but the thing is, if you stepped out of line in my cult, then you were basically kicked out of your forever family. You weren't family in the eternities. You didn't get to live in the same heaven as your family if you got kicked out. And that was an incredibly scary thing and a motivating factor to keep in line and for the cult to control us. That was a way of reframing our reality so that it was in our interest to be as subservient and obedient as possible. The Stumpy story is a huge, huge part of how cults exert control over people's minds, over people's wills, over people's agency. And, that's a big one. There's lots of other principles that we'll discuss down the line. There are different models that have been described by psychological professionals such as Robert J. Lifton, who described the thought reform practices of the Chinese Communist Party during the Korean War and came up with the 8 criteria for Chinese thought reform that are still used today to describe many of the cult behaviors, not just in, totalistic governments, but in religions and in relationships and in companies. These sorts of behaviors can emerge all over the place. Any place that people are trying to unethically control people. Other models include, Stephen Hassan's bite model. Stephen Hassan is, I should say, he's still kicking. So is Robert J. Lifton, by the way. Not fascinating character if you want to listen to him or Stephen Hassan. But Hassan was a former member of the Unification Church, also known as the Moonies or the Moon Cult. Basically, these followers of a South Korean gentleman who claimed to be the Messiah. There was a lot of Christianity mixed in with some other things. He claimed to be greater than Jesus. He would perform these mass weddings, supposedly by divine inspiration, and pair people up for the rest of their lives just looking at them, thousands of them at a time. Wild and crazy stuff. Stephen Hassan was involved with this cult, was recruited and controlled by them in the 70s and managed to escape. And he looked back at the situation, and like so many of us who escape cults, he was just astonished at how he could have been so thoroughly controlled. There's this myth that in order to be controlled, you have to be stupid. It's not true. In fact, smart people make some of the best cult members because they're some of the best at rationalizing the behavior. But what Lifton and Hassan and these many other researchers wanted to do was to explain these phenomena to help understand how people are so easily controlled, and more importantly, how to help people escape or prevent that captivity and promote human freedom and sovereignty on this earth. Now, it's particularly relevant today because these methods of coercive persuasion are utilized by religious and political movements that are causing a great deal of harm in the United States and in the world at large. And they're, at the roots of things. Well, again, I'm hesitant at the beginning here to name specific groups. You can probably imagine, because here's the other thing. The more I talk about specific groups, the more that it's going to potentially put off someone listening who would be in that specific group, and activate a resentment and kind of a defense mechanism of you're attacking me and my group, and therefore I'm not going to listen to you. That's a pretty common method of control in these groups. Phobia induction. I talked to you before about the Stumpy story. That's a mode of phobia induction, saying awful things are going to happen to you if you leave the group, or your family is going to be split up in the eternities if you leave the group. Another form of phobia induction is fear of anyone who speaks against the group or its teachings. Lots of different groups have names for that, and it's difficult in the first place to listen to someone who disagrees with you. That tends to rile us up neurologically. Again, that instinct to stick with our tribe is so incredibly strong, and someone speaking against the actions of our tribe or its leaders, and there's an instinct that jumps up and wants to defend, so that's hard enough on its own. But if you're in a group that is trying to control you unethically, then you start to run into other issues. They'll tell stories about people who have left the group. There's kind of character assassination that happens. They'll tell stories about how why people leave the groups. Now, I talked about Dr. Stephen Hassan. He's got a model called the influence continuum, which describes ways of influencing or persuading people from unethical to ethical, ways that are, manipulative and controlling and unkind, to ways that of influencing people that are clear, that they know what they're getting into, and you respect their ability to choose. Most cults claim to respect ability to choose, but they'll put in frameworks that do not respect people's ability to choose and are, in fact, very controlling. Among those methods is this idea that is inculcated into various cult members that there is no legitimate reason to leave the group. That's on the unethical side of the influence continuum of, it's ethical to say that someone can leave a group when they feel that they no longer want to be involved and there's no hard feelings. It's unethical to say that there's no legitimate reason to leave the group. And a lot of cults will do this. They'll say there's no good reason to leave the group. You leave it, you're going to go to hell, or you're going to get shunned, or you're going to have this happen to you in the eternities. I can tell you, there was a really meaningful experience that happened to me after I left the cult of my childhood, and I was still, seeking spiritual community. And there was a brief time when I went to kind of a local, kind of new agey, non-denominational church that didn't have a particular doctrine, just had a bunch of people who believed differently that wanted to get together for community. And they would have something kind of resembling a church service, but they were entirely in control of the doctrine, and they'd vote on things, and very democratic. It's not something I'm involved with anymore, but something I really appreciated about them was when I had been part of my cult, there were meticulous records that were kept of who was in the cult and who wasn't, who had been active in the cult. There were people weekly who would catalog the attendance and see who had been coming and who hadn't been coming, and statistics would be kept over time. If they were worried that you weren't coming to the meetings enough, they'd send people to your house to reach out and try to hook you back in. I was involved in a lot of meetings while I was growing up, and later as an adult, involved in the evangelistic aspects of it, and in working with the leadership and in trying to bring people back or reactivate people. And people would have these plans around how you were going to get people back, and because if you didn't come back, then you weren't living up to the tenets of the group, and you weren't going to have a forever family. And so everybody was scared for you that awful things were going to happen to you and your family in the eternities, and that you were going to be split up. And so they would desperately try to make sure that you were attending every week. And there was this guilt factor of, if you hadn't been attending, then you were a bad person. Or, I went to a university that was run by this group, and it was to the point where if you weren't active enough in this religious organization, you could get kicked out of school. I had one friend who, like me, was also transgender, and was going to another school that was run by this group. And when she started to come out and grow her hair a little bit long, because it helped with her mental health and in her gender presentation, she got kicked out of school, and they refused to transfer her credits to other places. So she basically had to start school over after having attended for like 3 years or something, as this real world punishment for not living up to these religious tenets. So, not attending these religious services was a very serious thing. And, those sorts of feelings kind of get ingrained in you. And after you escape, it takes years to get things out of you, get these oftentimes literally crazy beliefs out of you, and even if you know them not to be true, they're just so ingrained, and they continue to impact your mental health, your physical health, your relationships. But I had this really meaningful experience at this group, when I was looking for community on a Sunday after having left my group for the first time. They were very welcoming and kind. And then I went one week when I wasn't feeling well. I was struggling with my mental health. I still continue to struggle with my mental health. A lot of trauma as a result of having been raised in this group. But I came back to the New Age group, the second group, after having been gone for a week. I apologized for having not been there, and one of the members just kind of looked at me in perplexed and said, "Why are you sorry?" And I said, "Oh, I'm sorry. I wasn't here last week. I know it's important to," and they're like, "No. You come here when it's happy for you, when you feel like it's serving you, and when if you don't feel like coming for a week, or even if you feel like leaving altogether, we'll still love you just as much. There's no obligation." And that just kind of floored me. It was like so incredibly meaningful that, wait, I can stay or go and it's fine. That's one of the principles on the influence continuum. It's a red flag that you may be in a cult if you're taught that there's no legitimate reason to leave, or you're made to feel guilty for not being there all the time. There's lots of other principles, related to the control of the media that you ingest, related to the perception of leaders, related to the treatment of you from a physical standpoint. If you're kept too busy to think. There are other principles relating to how you deal with questions, and whether there's accountability for the leadership. Whether if say you've got a serious question about the group's teachings or history, or about the behavior of one of the leaders or something of that nature. If you raise that concern, any group can have issues or concerns, but if you raise that concern and it becomes your fault for being a doubter, that's a red flag. If you raise a concern and instead of dealing with the problem directly, they tell you to go repeat a ceremony. Oftentimes, there's this thing called thought stopping, and it comes in many forms. When you start to have a thought that's too divergent from the group, you can be taught to try to suppress those thoughts through various means. I had a bishop in the church that I was involved with who taught me to suppress my transgender experience with these visualization exercises, and it was essentially conversion therapy, and it destroyed my mental health for years, and I'm still dealing with those ramifications. But if they try to stop thoughts, if you have a question, and instead of having an answer to the question, or instead of saying I don't know, you're told to doubt your doubts. That's a thought stopping technique. If you're told to repeat a passage of scripture over and over again, or to chant, or to do excessive singing in order to, singing can be a very positive thing. Music is a very positive thing, but if it's used to drive away doubt, then that's a red flag. Another common one is to go through, a ceremony, repeat a ceremony. There's I don't know if you know the cartoon television show Avatar: The Last Airbender. There's a great example of thought control through ceremony in this story, where there's a city that is under control of a group called the Dai Li, and when people begin to think too divergently in the city, and they're not towing the party line, they're sent away to this place called Lake Laogai to be brainwashed. they have to sit in a chamber and go through this long ceremony until they're back in line. And that may seem pretty fantasy and pretty like it would only happen in a fictional universe, but I experienced something very similar to that growing up. We had these ceremonies that would happen in our cult, sometimes an hour to even 2 hours long. And whenever people had doubts or questions, they would be told to go participate in these ceremonies. You were supposed to participate them on the regular regardless, because they were a great mechanism of control, but particularly if you had a doubt. And it was the same ceremony. It wouldn't necessarily speak to whatever question that you had, but it would really enhance that feeling of group togetherness, of being a part of your tribe. It would leverage that sense of peace that you feel being with your group. The ceremony was very slow-paced, very rhythmic. You would do lots of things in synchrony, both speaking and with motions. You're all dressed the same. And it's something that you've heard over and over and over again, and so you can kind of switch off and kind of ponder about what your issue may be, and you may come up with some ideas yourself, but by the end of it, you end up feeling very relaxed, and you've been doing things rhythmically with other people for quite a while, and you're told that you're in this special place that's a sacred place where God communicates with you and all of this. And tell you what, the virtues of these ceremonies were extolled growing up. They were the center of everything that we did in that cult. And I lost count, though, of the number of times you'd go to one of our church meetings and someone would stand up at the front of the meeting and say, I had this doubt, I had this worry, I was worried about some of the history of the church and whether or not it was true, and if these bad things had happened, and if I was part of this bad thing that I had been shoehorned into being a part of. But I went and I did this ceremony, and by the end of it, I didn't really have an answer to my question, but I felt at peace, and I knew that was God telling me that it was okay and that I was in the right place. And this is seen as an affirmation of the truthfulness of the group, and that you should ignore all of the issues with it. But in retrospect, it's actually pretty creepy. It's like, hey, I was doubting the Dai Li, and I was worried about some of the creepy stuff happening, but I went to Lake Laogai and I came back feeling so much better, and now I believe in the party. And in retrospect, so sketch and creepy, but that's the way that things are when you're a part of it, and especially when you're raised in it. It feels like this normal thing. Again, I was born into it. My dad, his parents were convinced to join when he was about 4 years old, so he was very close to being born in it. They're converts, but they're also people that are lifelong cult members. And when you come out of it, you have to build your reality from the ground up, and you have all of this trauma and damage from being so thoroughly and deeply manipulated. It's difficult to convey just like how deep the control is. It's in your bones. It's everything about your reality. Back to this idea of a Stumpy story. There's a saying that if we can be made to believe absurdities, we can be made to commit atrocities. The stories that we believe are the frame of our reality. A lot of people speak about the power of stories to do good, and they really do. They can inspire, they can make us laugh, they can comfort us when we're having a hard time. But tell you what, there are there's nothing more toxic than a cult story, than a frame of mind that can take a good person's good intentions and turn them towards harm. There's another quote: left to their own devices, good people will do good things and bad people will do bad things. But for good people to do bad things, that takes religion. Now, not all religions are harmful. They exist on different spectra in terms of their ethics and the way that they influence people. But I can tell you what, growing up LGBT in a cult that taught me that people like me weren't supposed to exist, and if people like me dared to exist and act on our feelings, then we were going to hell, then we were, all these awful things, that we were the most disgusting thing possible. That does deep, deep harm. I was taught that my gender identity was Satan, literally Satan, and I believed it because these were the authority figures in my life. These are the people that I was groomed from my infanthood up to believe were the ultimate arbiters of truth and representatives of God on earth. And they were telling me that if you didn't feel right in your body, then that wasn't right according to God's plan, and that probably what was going on was that there was, Satan trying to tempt you and an evil spirit. And tell you what, I had exorcism after exorcism after exorcism trying to put my gender identity out of me as if it were Satan. And I started to believe that portion of me was Satan. And I became deeply, deeply suicidal by the end of it. You can imagine if you're taught that your identity is Satan, you would want to get rid of yourself too, right? I mean, not to make light of suicidality, but it's incredibly, deeply harmful stuff. And I want to protect people from what I went through. And part of my healing and part of my taking my power back, I've spent the last couple of years in this torturous process of extracting myself from the cult, both in terms of attending and associating with it, but also, it's your entire social system and identity, and that stuff doesn't leave you very easily. It's metastasizes through your entire system. I like to think of your social system as being a biological system, just like your nervous system or your skeletal system or your muscular system. You rip one of those out and you're going to have some major issues. And that's one of the things that makes cults so dangerous is, by the time that you realize it's toxic, it's so deeply embedded into you as a person that, removal is a major medical operation, and you're going to need, the help of medical professionals in getting through it. And you're probably going to be in recovery for years, depending on how deep you were. For me, I didn't know anything else. Again, I was born into it, and I was fortunate enough to escape. I'll probably tell more of that story at another time. But part of my recovery is taking my own power back to protect other people so they don't have to go through what I went through. I want to spread cult literacy so that people can have freedom to liberate their thoughts. Everybody wants to be free, but not everybody has the tools. And this is one place where you can find the tools. Now, most cults are going to tell you that they are the ultimate source of truth and not to listen to anything that conflicts with them. I want to avoid that. Obviously, I've got my own opinions, but I want to invite you that, while I think this is going to be a good source to listen to. I'm a science communicator by profession, but I'm not a doctor. this is educational and not medical advice, I would invite you to spend time with your own medical professionals as you deal with whether it's your own cult trauma or figuring out a game plan to help someone that is close to you. Specifically, mental health professionals that deal with trauma and with cult exit counseling. Both very helpful. Other resources I would recommend. Stephen Hassan has an excellent website called freedomofmind.com. There's an excellent channel on YouTube called Telltale by Owen Morgan. There's various resources out there. You'll probably find some of your own. Eventually, I'll put a resource page together. But let this be the beginning of your exploration and not the end. And yeah, with that, I'll kind of wrap up this first episode of Flit Cult Lit. Hopefully, as time goes on, the production value will increase. I'll have short videos on specific topics, other videos on models, whether it's Lifton's 8 criteria or Stephen Hassan's bite model or what have you. I think this is really important information to get out there so that people can be free to live their own lives, and also so that, as a culture more broadly, we can de-radicalize, decrease conflict, de-escalate, and start to work together to solve our problems instead of having tribes just fighting each other all the time. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this first episode, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Keep up your mental hygiene. Stay skeptical. Check your sources before you repost anything on social media, because that's how a lot of this radicalization happens. And, follow your bliss. Follow what makes you happy and tell your own story rather than letting someone else dictate it to you. With that, my deepest wishes of love and freedom to you and yours. Over and out.